Hello and welcome. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most game-changing events in all of modern history, the American Revolution. It's an epic story, really. It's about protest, it's about war, and it's about the birth of a nation that was built on some truly radical new ideas. But you know what's wild? It all kicked off because of a surprisingly common drink. Right? A revolution? Over tea? How on earth does a simple protest about tea spiral into a full-blown war that ends up creating the United States of America? It sounds almost made up, but that is exactly what happened, and it all traces back to one single dramatic night of defiance. So let's go there. Let's talk about how the fuse was lit. It happened in a single dramatic act that has since become the stuff of legend. Our story begins in Boston Harbor. Now, the sheer scale of this is just stunning. I mean, this was not just a few angry guys tipping over some crates. No. This was a highly organized, very deliberate act of political theater and, frankly, economic sabotage. By destroying what would be a fortune in tea today, these colonists were sending a crystal-clear message to London. We will not be controlled by your corporations, and we will not be controlled by your taxes. But let's be absolutely clear about this. This was never really just about the price of tea. Not at all. This was about a deep, philosophical clash that had been simmering for years, this huge divide between the American colonists and the British Crown. So on one side, you've got the colonists, right? They're just soaking up these radical new Enlightenment ideas about things like liberty, natural rights, and self-government. They really believed they should be able to trade with whoever they wanted and govern themselves. But then, on the other side, you've got the massive British Empire. And they saw the colonies as, well, a cash cow, a place to get raw materials and self-finished goods, all designed to make Britain rich and powerful. And, after the incredibly expensive 7 Years' War, Britain needed that cash more than ever.
And that brings us to this phrase. This became the rallying cry for an entire generation. And the key thing to understand here is that the issue wasn't really the cost of the tax itself. It was about the principle. The colonists were absolutely furious that a parliament 3,000 miles away, a parliament where they had 0 elected representatives, could just claim the authority to take their money. This was a fundamental fight over power and consent.
So it started out with slogans and boycotts? Well, it quickly spiraled out of control. Every single action from one side led to an even stronger, more intense reaction from the other. It really created this rapid, 10-year countdown to all-out war.
You can really see the domino effect here, can't you? First, Britain imposes the Stamp Act, a direct tax on paper. Well, who does that enrage the most? The most vocal people in society, lawyers and journalists. So tensions rise, and that leads to the Boston Massacre, basically a street brawl that gets spun into this powerful symbol of British tyranny. Then, after the Tea Party, Britain just cracks down hard with what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's economy, they banned public meetings, and for the colonists, that was the last straw. By 1775, the talking was over. The shooting had begun. And we really can't talk about this escalation without mentioning groups like the Sons of Liberty. I mean, these weren't just a few concerned citizens. These guys were master organizers. They were agitators. Led by radicals like Samuel Adams, they organized boycotts, they created incredibly effective propaganda. And this is crucial. They built a network. Through something called the Committees of Correspondence, which was essentially an organized letter-writing system, they connected all 13 colonies. They turned what were separate grievances into a single, unified continental movement.
And then came the spark that really turned this tax rebellion into a revolution for independence. Thomas Paine's little pamphlet, Common Sense, was an absolute game-changer. Using this really simple, direct language that anyone could understand, he basically argued that it was absurd for a tiny island to rule an entire continent, and that the only logical path forward was a complete and total break from Britain. It went viral, 18th century style, and it convinced countless ordinary people that independence wasn't just possible, it was their destiny.
Okay, so the war is in full swing. Public opinion is all fired up, and the colonists were finally ready to take that final, terrifying leap. They were about to declare themselves a completely new country. I mean, these have to be some of the most famous words ever written in the English language. Drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence wasn't just some breakup letter to King George. It was a mission statement. It was a vision for a whole new kind of nation, one founded on these Enlightenment principles of equality, liberty, and the right of the people to govern themselves.
And what they created was, well, it was truly revolutionary for its time. Think about it. In a world that was full of kings and emperors, they created a republic. Instead of ruling by the whims of a monarch, they created the world's first written constitution, a government of laws. They separated powers into different branches to make sure no one person or group could become a tyrant. And then they added a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. This was a completely new political experiment. Of course, beautiful ideals don't win wars. Armies do. And after years of absolutely brutal fighting, General George Washington's Continental Army, with what was absolutely essential help from Britain's old rival France, finally forced the British to surrender at Yorktown. The experiment had survived. So, the American Revolution ended up inspiring movements for freedom all across the globe. But back home, the legacy of this radical break was, and it still is, deeply complicated. You see, the Declaration of Independence made these beautiful, soaring promises. But for this new nation that was struggling to define itself, the answer to that question, who are these promises for? Well, that answer was dangerously narrow. And this is where the harsh contrast between the ideal and the reality just becomes so clear. The phrase was all men are created equal, but in practice, the rights only applied to white property-owning men, a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. They built a nation that was supposedly dedicated to liberty, while in some colonies, a third of the people were enslaved. Power wasn't seized by the people, it was just transferred from one group of wealthy white men in England to another group of wealthy white men in America. So what does this number mean? 170? Well, that's the number of years it took after the Declaration of Independence for African Americans to finally secure the legal right to vote with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 170 years. It's just a stark reminder of how long and difficult the journey has been to even begin to live up to the nation's founding ideals. So, in the end, what do we make of this? The American Revolution was, in many ways, profoundly hypocritical and tragically incomplete. It preached freedom while it practiced slavery. And yet, the ideas it unleashed, ideas of self-governance, of natural rights, of liberty, they were just too powerful to be contained. They became a blueprint for future revolutions and a standard against which the nation itself would be judged for centuries, fueling struggles for abolition, for civil rights, for women's suffrage. And it just reminds us that the fight for these ideals, it's never really over.